This is the OnePlus 7 Pro, and it's been my phone for the past 2 years or so.
This video is not sponsored by OnePlus.
It's been a pretty good phone for me. Though, when it was released, it got sort of mediocre reviews on its camera, which focused primarily on its use of computational photography. But this phone has something else that makes it a little more special. Well, honestly, most smartphones have it. It's the ability to shoot raw DNG files. And what that does is it removes all the software rendering and just shoots straight to the sensor and then outputs it in its raw format. Now, when you take this file, you can edit it and pull the lights and shadows all around and edit the colors to your liking. And it's just less noisy, less blocky, there's no artifacting. It just ends up being a much, much better result. Now, if you clicked on this video, it's either you're wondering what Cinema DNG is, or you know what Cinema DNG is and you want to see it done. We're getting there. But this is like my 12th take on this video because of various reasons, so I need to explain things, so bear with me. First of all, back to the phone. Now, when OnePlus released this phone, it came with a Sony IMX 586 sensor. I can never remember those model numbers. But what it does is it's a 48 megapixel. It's a 48 megapixel sensor that downsamples down 4 times to take 4 pixels and mush them into one, so you get a 12 megapixel image. This subsampling allows you to get a little bit better results because bigger pixels are less noisy. Now, even though that it only shoots in 8-bit, it still does a pretty good job of its color representation. Now, more clarity on the 8-bit, it's 8-bit per channel for the RGB channel, so 8 times 3 equals 24-bit color. Also, this phone came with UFS 3 memory, so that means that it can read and write at much faster rates than traditional flash memory. And it's pretty much the standard now when it comes to smartphones. And it allows for a total write speed of 410 megabytes a second. This number is important, we'll return to it later. Okay, back to Cinema DNG. So we already established that DNG is a raw file format for photos. It's not technically raw, raw is a different type of format, but DNG just removes a little bit more metadata than raw, but it's pretty much of the same quality. It's just a different type of file format. And DNG itself stands for digital negative. And if you come from the film world, you know that negatives are, well, the actual film. Cinema DNG is basically just a sequence of those raw pictures smooshed together into a video file. Sometimes I don't even think Cinema DNG always comes as a video file. Sometimes it's just the sequence of frames that you put into and process together, which is what I did. For this experiment, I wanted to see what it would look like from a phone, from the raw data, how good the video could actually look if it was in Cinema DNG. And like normal DNG RAWs, being able to edit footage that is completely raw for video means that you can get way more dynamic range, you can play with the colors a whole lot more, it's just much more editable, and also less noisy, with no chunky artifacts that you're used to seeing in mobile phone video. Time to get to the process. Well, we already established earlier what the write speed of this phone is with the UFS 3 storage. The problem is my DNG files from my phone when I shoot a 12 megapixel photo is they are 22 megabytes each on average. Now 22 times 24 to get the desired 24 frames a second means that we're talking about 528 megabytes a second, which is over the 410 megabytes per second write speed that is the limitation of the storage. And that's understandable. That's an insane amount of storage. That's an insane amount of data to be written at one time. And not to mention that the camera itself cannot take more than 1 or 2 photos per second. So basically, I have to resort to what would essentially be a time lapse. Granted, it wouldn't be the traditionally like super fast time lapse, it would be a little bit sped up footage. So in order to get consistent footage, I would go out with the camera and set everything to manual. Depending on the scenario, most of the time I would set the focus to infinity because was primarily shooting landscapes and things that weren't super close. Then I would adjust the shutter speed to be the appropriate settings for being outside and the ISO as low as possible. And I also kept the white balance consistent too, because we didn't want it to change color temperatures and bounce all around, just like we wouldn't want the exposure to change every frame, because then it would just be like the stroby flashy effect and it would be terrible. So once I shot all my sequences, I had hundreds and hundreds of photos. Traditionally, we would take all that footage and edit it in Premiere Pro, but Premiere Pro didn't like working on my DNG files and ended up with like this red blank screen, and it just fell apart, even though like the few frames that did work looked great, and you know, adjusting them with Lumetric colors and putting on LUTs looked fantastic. It was so crispy clear. It was promising, but I had to find another way to make it work. So since they're photos, I just dragged all of them per sequence into Lightroom and started working on the edits there. So for each sequence, I would take one frame, that was a good representation of that scene, and then edit it accordingly. I would take the highlights, raise them, lower them, whatever they needed to be done, color correct, add clarity, all that, and then apply it to the entire sequence. Once I was done with that, I would export it in the highest quality format I could that wasn't DNG. Then I took all those frames and dropped them into Premiere, put them at 2 frames per image so that it would end up being about 12 frames per second in a 24 FPS timeline. I chose 2 frames per image because in an animation, a lot of times they would work on 2s, which meant that they would have 2 frames per 1 image to sort of stretch it out a little bit. And it worked out a little bit better. It helped slow things down at least a little. One of the other issues I ran into, since a lot of this footage was handheld, there was a decent bit of shake. So with a little warp stabilizer, you can help it out at least a little bit. The other problem was that it's still kind of fast. And sometimes that can look okay, but sometimes it's just kind of jarring. So I wanted to see if I could stretch things out even further by bringing them into After Effects and applying time warp. Now what time warp does is it helps make in-between frames by using vectors and sort of stretching it out and sort of figuring out what the image is and what would look good in between. The problem is at this speed, didn't work out so good, and it had some pretty trippy results. Even though like some of these shots took like 16 hours to render. I really tried hard to make it work, but it's not really intended for this use. You of course could probably try optical flow, but that's only gonna give you limited results. But if you can forgive the fluidity of the shots, you can pause it and see just how clear these images are. And being able to edit them like this is impressive for a smartphone. Again, there's only a few cameras that actually shoot in true Cinema DNG. And being able to see what video would look like if you push the sensor to its limits was in the end pretty satisfying for me. Do I think they'll implement this in phones in the future? Depends how far into the future we're talking. Again, the write speeds really need to be a lot faster for this to be achievable. And even though the maximum storage in phones is increasing, it's gonna take a lot to be able to use this practically. If they made a smaller sensor, maybe an 8 megapixel sensor, which is a little bit closer to 4K, at least traditional UHD, I think the file sizes of the DNG would drop below the UFS storage write speeds. Then maybe we're talking. I think the processors are good enough to handle this. The fact of the matter is, whether I like it or not, this is a very niche thing to be into, so I don't think it's really gonna be a thing. The ability to make an app for a phone that could support such a thing, now that might be something. But for now, I'm gonna have to stick to just what I got. And if anyone else is interested in trying this, I would love to see what you come up with. I guess what I learned is that I still don't know how to properly end a video.